Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel. I am the program coordinator for the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry. If you like what you see today, just check us out. You know how you got here, dphi.org. Like to welcome you all to this event tonight, Pondering President Putin with Dr. Getty. And I'd like to share some thanks to the history department for helping us put this on. Big props to them. Welcome here. I'm going to introduce you to our moderator for tonight, our local expert on European and modern history, Dr. Andrea Maestra Juan. And I'm sure if we were all in person, you'd give her a warm welcome. Enjoy the event.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor J.R.H. Getty. Professor Getty is the Distinguished Research Professor of History at UCLA. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the Soviet period and at Stalin. Professor Getty has been the John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, a Senior Research Fellow at Columbia, at Harvard, and the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He has been a visiting scholar in Europe from the Sorbonne to Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His work has has really focused on Stalinist policies, particularly around the purges, the Great Terror. He was one of the kind of founding members of the revisionist school of the Stalinist period. And revolutionized how scholars have interpreted the Stalinist period and our understanding of the purges. I know it's a pleasure for me because not only was Professor Getty a mentor and advisor when I was a graduate student at UCLA, but he's also a very dear friend. I have had the great honor of traveling with Arch and his family to Russia a couple of times, and one of the most profound experiences of my life I shared with his family. And highly recommend to my students that it should be on everybody's bucket list to walk through Red Square on a dark, cold, snowy December evening to really feel and hear the ghosts of Russia's past. He is also an expert tour guide. He guided some friends through the streets of St. Petersburg and was very instrumental in providing me with some vodka. He made a phone call on his cell phone while we were there, and a few minutes later, a car pulled up, popped open the trunk, and there were quite literally tens of bottles of vodka, to which my current chair of the history department was the recipient of one of those gifts I brought back from St. Petersburg. And finally, I would be amiss if I didn't mention that we met over beagles when a long time ago, many years ago, and he gave me his family gave me one of my first beagles, and I have been infected by the beagle bug ever since. So I will now turn it over to my very dear friend and a very admired mentor, Professor Getty.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction. It's always dangerous when a friend introduces you because they know entirely too much about your background. I'm also grateful to the the MSU Denver History Department and the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry for setting all this up. I am happy to be here, virtually at least. At the moment, I'm in Los Angeles, California, but we can pretend like I'm there. Two things I'd like to do today. Two questions I'd like to address. Why is Putin so popular? And secondly, what is Putinism? So it's a little combination of history and political science. Next slide, please. Who is Putin? Go ahead and click some more. Putin, as we know, came from the KGB in 1975. Here you have his Stasi identification card when he was a Soviet spy in Germany. He became an automatic member of the East German Security Service, the Stasi. We know, therefore, he comes from a KGB background. But in 1991, he reinvents himself as a Russian reformer back in Leningrad. He attaches himself to the reformist democratic city administration, which makes him the head of Leningrad's foreign economic relations. This is a huge job that puts him in touch with all kinds of money and all kinds of people and all kinds of people with money. He takes the same job with him to Moscow, where he's the chief of presidential property, which basically controls all the property in the country that used to owned by the Communist Party. 1998, he's head of the KGB. 1999, Yeltsin makes him prime minister, and in 2000, he becomes president. Why is he so popular with Russians? Well, one thing is that he's an easy act to follow. Brezhnev, for example, was a fairly undignified Soviet leader toward the end of his years and had the strangest connection, love for Chuck Connors, the American cowboy actor. Some of you may remember the rifleman, Chuck Connors. Brezhnev was fixated on this guy. And at one point, Richard Nixon introduces Brezhnev to Chuck Connors. Easy act to follow.
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Писахат.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
In addition to being an easy act to follow, Putin and his people are skilled at branding himself, presenting himself in a particularly Russian relevant kind of way. He's firm, he's manly, he's charming.
I found my thrill on blueberry hill.
He's also conscious of branding himself in a Russian kind of way in terms of line of descent and line of succession. Here you have the Tsar, the last Tsar, photographed with his son, sending the clear message, there is a successor. Lenin and Stalin did the same thing, establishing a visual connection with the former leader. Here you have Stalin showing himself in line of descent from Marx via Engels and Lenin. And here you have Putin's version, riding a snowmobile with Medvedev, his former successor, an updated version of the old Russian and Soviet line of succession. Here's the leader and the one who will follow. Russian branding also has to do with military strength. Here you have the last Tsar as an army officer. Lenin, gigantic Lenin astride the troops. Lenin and Stalin, giants with airplanes and tanks. And Brezhnev in his military uniform with about 36 unearned medals, including 4 heroes of the Soviet Union for doing absolutely nothing, all kinds of war prizes and war awards that he didn't earn. I always thought, how does he stand up with all that brass on his chest? But it's important for the leader to present himself as a military man. There we go. Putin does the same thing. He doesn't wear an army officer uniform, but he might as well. It's important for Russian branding that the leader is kind. Here you have Lenin with the children. Lenin, by the way, despised children. Stalin with the children. Putin with the children. He's even kind to horses and dogs. He kisses horses. The leader has to be kind. The leader also has to be religious. Here you have the last Tsar worshiping. There's a gap here with all the atheist Soviet leaders, but Putin has now found Jesus after a life of atheism and as a KGB officer. But it's important to show himself as religious because that's a part of Russian branding. But Russian branding has its limits. Putin likes to cuddle up to the church. He likes to be a Christian. He visits monasteries, but it has its limits. You can't kiss his hand. Yuck. The third reason for his popularity is that he brings stability. Stability. Since the Khrushchev days in the 60s, Russia had been unstable, especially after Brezhnev, in fact. You never knew what tomorrow would bring. Putin brings predictability. That predictability has to do with stabilizing the economy. It has to do with stabilizing prices. And Russians are prepared, as they always have been, to trade democracy for stability, for predictability any day, to know what's happening the next day. And if it's a dictator, if it's a KGB thug that promises that, that's a deal they're prepared to make. He also speaks for Russian attitudes and beliefs. He doesn't do what communist leaders used to do, which was preach Marxism. His attitudes and beliefs, his policies resonate with Russians in a Russian kind of way. First of all, Russians see themselves as historical victims, not aggressors. They've been invaded many times by all kinds of people. The memory of World War II is still alive. Therefore, when NATO expansion came up to Russia's borders, it produced a really bad reaction. A bad reaction so bad that I'll read you a couple of quotes. George Kennan, the senior American diplomat, Russian specialist about NATO expansion, said, "I think it's a tragic mistake. There's no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia." Putin himself said, when it happened, NATO kept telling us the same thing. Oh, this doesn't bother you. This doesn't concern you. This is not against you. Did they think we are idiots? When a military bloc approaches our borders, we have grounds for apprehension, and we must take certain steps. You know, there's a limit to everything, Putin said. If you compress the spring all the way to its limit, it will snap back. Russians are also aggravated about Russian principles, Western principles, preached to them. They see it as hypocrisy. When America lectures the Russians on their bad behavior, the Russians wonder about throwing stones in glass houses. For example, they wonder about how can you complain to us about protecting our borders when you tried to invade Cuba? How can you talk to us about aggression when you're fighting several wars in the Middle East at the same time, far from your borders? Therefore, they see American warnings and strategic comments as hypocrisy. Russians also resented being patronized. They want to be treated, they want to be thought of as a great European power. This is an age-old trope in Russia. They desperately want to be Europeans. They want to be seen as Europeans, not Asians. They want to be thought of as a European power. They don't want to be lectured to by Europe as if they were some kind of barbarians from the East. Being patronized is something that is bound to produce a bad reaction with a Russian on the street, among friends, and especially among leaders. So now we have a good idea of why he's popular at home. But what is it? What is Putinism? Well, there are several possibilities. One of them is that he is a totalitarian, just like Hitler, just like Stalin. The totalitarian model has one-person leadership, liquidation of opponents, patriotism, scapegoating race or class, but most importantly, total control of society, state control of the economy, and mass terror. Putin has some of these characteristics, but the most important ones, total control of society, state control of the economy, and mass terror, he doesn't have. And the things he does share with the totalitarian model, one-person leadership, liquidation of opponents, patriotism, there are a lot of regimes around the world today that are the same. What's unique about totalitarianism are the three things here that he doesn't share with them. What about Tsarism? Is Putin just another Russian czar? Well, some of the same things we saw in totalitarianism, one-person leadership, patriotism, legitimacy by blood in a monarchy, hereditary noble elite in a monarchy. People are subjects. The czar changes according to family succession. Putin has some of these, same things he shared with totalitarianism, but he doesn't share most things with a czarist model. There's no hereditary elite, there's no legitimacy by blood. the top job is not inherited in the family. Here's another model. I call it the mafia kleptocracy, a system about basically corruption and theft. Our familiar things are here, one-person leadership, but here you don't even have any institutions. Institutions don't matter. What matters is the personalized power of the mafia chieftains, each of which heads a clan or a family. One's loyalty is to clan, not to institutions. The leader, the chief Don Corleone, mediates and balances the clans. If any of them get out of line, he liquidates them. Here we have, therefore, an informal political structure. It's not about institutions. It's not about states and bureaucracies. It's about personal connections. The goal of this is simple enrichment and corruption. And the succession is violent, almost always. No mafia don gives up power quietly or bloodlessly. The Putin regime shares all of these. It's the one ism, the one model we can look at where it's almost an identical fit between the mafia structure and Putin. I tell my students that if you want to understand the structure of power in Russia today, think of the Sicilian model as a model. It's about persons, it's about connections, it's about patrons and clients. It's about clans. So the Putin mix, what is Putinism, I think is a combination of mafia kleptocracy with Russian roots. Massive corruption at all levels, one-person leadership, personalized power, competing clans, no real institutions. Your power in this system, no matter who you are, is not about the job you hold. It's about your proximity to a powerful person. Here's an example. In the KGB under Putin, there were 4 different clans, each led by a KGB general. Putin's job was to balance that somehow, to keep those clans from killing each other. They actually started to. They started arresting each other in airports and things. Putin stepped in and resolved the thing by creating 3 new heads of the KGB. There are now 4 versions of the KGB. He put each mafia don in a job so they could each say that they were the head of an agency and a clan. Their power, therefore, had nothing to do with the agency or job title. Their power came from the person of Putin. Succession is unclear, just like in the mafia. Just like in the mafia, opponents are liquidated, marginalized. The goal pretty clearly is enrichment and corruption. Everybody is allowed to steal all they can. There's no independent anti-corruption police. There's no independent judiciary. There's just a kind of a war, constant struggle of all against all to divide the pork chop. This all in the context of an industrial society, which is not typically of the mafia, and an environment of Russian patriotism. So what I'm suggesting to you today is, if you want to understand Putin, think of the Sicilian mafia in Russia. Conclusions. Putinism is not totalitarianism. It's not a monarchy. It's a mafia plus Russia tradition is the best model that fits the situation. Putin doesn't want to restore the USSR, another thing you often hear. He has spoken against it, in fact. Putin said at one point, anybody who is not nostalgic for the Soviet Union has no heart. Anybody who wants the Soviet Union back has no brains. If he wanted to restore the USSR, he could have done it already, militarily. More than that, though, the non-Russian parts of the USSR, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, were always considered by Russians to be a drag on the market. They thought that they were little welfare takers, that resources went from Moscow to them. better off without them. Besides that, from the Putin point of view, it's better just to focus on the Russian-speaking territories. There's plenty to steal there without a Soviet Union and all the complications that brings. He does want secure borders. It's an open question whether he is expansionist. I don't think he is. But he does insist, as all Russians, innately understand, he does insist on secure borders. He does insist on no military threats in his own backyard. That ends my presentation. People often ask about good things to read about Putin. There are a lot of bad things to read about Putin, including the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. But I think 3 really good books on the situation there by Tony Wood, Mark Galeotti, and Fiona Hill. I understand Fiona Hill is going to be speaking at Metro State sometime in the near future. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope I've given you something to think about. Here you see my email. If you don't manage to get your question in the Q&A period, please feel free to email me and I'll do the best I can to answer you. Thank you.
Okay. We're now in the question and answer period. We do have one question that was posted in the chat during your talk. And the question is, in their trading democracy for stability and predictability, are Russians in an abusive relationship with Putin?
That's an interesting way to put it. I'm not sure I would call it that, because that's always been the pattern in Russian history. People worship the Tsar, who was an absolutist monarch, a dictator. They had no rights at all, but he seemed to guarantee stability and predictability, and he was the chosen of God. It was a divine right monarchy. You move into the Soviet period, where there were very few of what we would call civil rights or human rights, but there was at least a kind of predictability. After Stalin's death, and especially as Brezhnev faded from the scene, everything became incredibly chaotic. You had a weak leader, not a strong hand at the helm, and you had chaos. Russians hated that period. And in fact, today, a Russian curse word for the reform period, a Russian curse word is democracy, which was the buzzword at the time during Yeltsin and Gorbachev, democracy. For them, democracy meant nothing in the stores. A friend of mine once said about the Brezhnev period, Brezhnev was, the leader. He was the chief. Nobody else counted. But there was always sausage in the stores. Maybe not 10 different kinds, but there was always sausage in the stores. Given Russia's chaotic history of turmoil and violence and revolution, in a sense, it's not hard to see how they would highly value stability above everything else, including democracy.
Okay, thank you. Another question in the chat. A question about what appears to be a kind of schizophrenia when it comes to the, quote, Russian branding, unquote, you spoke of. And it appears to go back to Stalin, judging from your comments. How does one simultaneously claim to be a successor to Marx and Lenin and the Tsar? Does that dual legacy function in contemporary Russian identity?
Well, maybe I expressed it badly, but neither the Lenins or the Stalins trace their lineage to the Tsar. And Putin doesn't trace his lineage to the communists, although he's trying to link up with the Tsarist period. The point I was trying to make was that lineage of some kind is important as a principle, that any Russian leader has to have a lineage to somebody previously. It doesn't necessarily have to be to the Tsar. It doesn't necessarily have to be to the Soviet Union. I was just trying to say that lineage is important because what that means to the Russian mind frequently is legitimacy.
Okay, great. Another question, are there factors, traditions within Russia that threaten Putin?
I would say not so many from Russian culture, or not so many having to do with Russian patriotism. But as James Carville said, in American politics, it's the economy, stupid. What we see is that Putin's rating, which is always very high, by the way, even by independent polling, his rating does fluctuate. And as the economy gets bad, his approval goes down, but it goes down from like 90 to 65, which is still pretty high as approval ratings go. That economic fluctuation has to do with pretty much one factor, and that's the world price of oil. The Russian economy is sustained by exporting oil and other raw materials, but principally oil. World price of oil goes down, the Russian economy goes down, Putin's ratings go down. Oil up, economy up, Putin up. As for actual physical human threats, I don't really see anybody on the horizon. The closest thing would be Navalny, the anti-corruption campaigner who's now in prison on a hunger strike. But Putin has always found it very easy to isolate, marginalize, or even kill anybody who's a challenger. His only vulnerability that I see is the economy.
Okay, you mentioned that Russians prioritize stability over anything. What is the stability of Russia like today, and has it interfered with Russians' public opinion of Putin?
Well, one of the reasons I think his opinion rating is generally high. By the way, that's a new word in Russian, rating. It never counted under the Soviets because nobody got to rate anybody. Rating, Putin's rating is always high. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
And I'm gonna add another question that's very similar to that. So the original question, what is the stability of Russia like today? And how has it interfered with ordinary Russians' public opinion of Putin? And a related question is, how does Putin's popularity imply? What does Putin's popularity imply about Russians' general national character? Maybe those are two separate questions.
Well, I'll do my best. As far as Russian national character goes, I'm always kind of dubious of that as a main principle. Certainly Russian's character is different from our character. But as far as his rating is concerned, as I said before, it's really tied to the economy. He is Teflon invulnerable on Russian culture, on patriotism, on military strength. When he seized the Crimea, for example, his polling numbers, his rating went sky high. Russians approved of that. When he gave Russian support to the Ukrainian separatists in East Ukraine, which is still going on, his rating went sky high, which tells me, first of all, that his policies do resonate with Russians. And secondly, that on that score, he can really do no wrong. And that's why even when the economy tanks, he goes down, but he doesn't totally tank because he has a lot of reserve credibility and popularity.
Okay, and do you want to address the question about the Russian national character and Putin's popularity? Is there a Russian national character?
You know, the problem with national character arguments is it's so easy to take them too far. You know, when Europeans say, well, you Americans are all this, Well, in fact, there's lots of Americans who are this, that, and the other thing. If there were elements to a Russian character that you could point to, and again, I don't want to make them into a huge causal factor that explains anything, but because they have a different history and a different culture than we do, they do see some things differently than we do. For example, part of Russian character is superstition. Even educated people will cross the street to avoid a black cat. Is that Russian culture? Is that Russian national tradition? Well, maybe. Russians, for example, anti-Semitism in Russia is big and it's not unpopular. Is that Russian? Does that have other factors? How can we use that to explain anything? I have heard some interesting stories about Russian character that Russians have told me. One of my Russian friends said, you know, if you have a house and you add to it and it's the best house on the street, you Americans would go to your neighbor and say, hey, that's a great house. I really like your house. A Russian would keep his mouth shut and burn it down at night. I don't know if that's Russian national character or not, but you hear those kinds of stories often enough where you kind of start to wonder.
Okay, that gives me a great image continue on with the questions. Another question is, thank you very much for your talk. Might you be able to speak a bit about the structural forces that have helped create and maintain a mafia state, particularly economic or legal forces, deregulation, oil, gas, etc.?
Structural factors. It's hard to think of structural factors creating a system that doesn't have a structure. Part of the reason why I think the mafia clientele model works so well in Russia is because it's always been there lurking behind the scenes. It's the way Russians have always kind of understood the way life works. Here's another story a Russian told me. He and I were walking across Red Square and he said, Arch, you're so naive. And I said, what? He said, you believe in government. You believe in structures and you believe in courts and you believe that structures have a reality to them. You've bought Max Weber, lock, stock, and barrel. He said, we don't believe that. I said, what do you mean you don't believe that? He said, well, let me explain to you how Moscow is governed. The Chechen mafia from Chechnya, they control prostitution in Moscow. If you want to do something with women, you do it with the Chechens or they kill you. The Yaroslavl mafia, they control fruits and vegetables. If you want to do anything with fruits and vegetables in Moscow, you do it with the Yaroslavl boys. Otherwise, they kill you. And then he pointed to the Kremlin and he said, that's the biggest mafia gang of all. He said, they do not women, not fruits and vegetables, they do politics. And if you want to do anything about politics in this country, you do it with them or with their permission, or they kill you. The way he looked at the world, therefore, was that there was no government, that was a mirage. There were no institutions, that was all fakery. What there was groups of people doing things, which means legal and illegal doesn't mean anything anymore because the whole system is illegally legal or legally illegal. The whole system is based on how your group can watch each other's backs and control something. And for him, the government was just another clan, just another mafia, just like the Chechens, just like the Yaroslavl boys, just like a bunch of others. In other words, the point I'm trying to make here is that Russians have always seen government as an illusion. They've mistrusted it for years, centuries. They've mistrusted it because they never thought it did them any good. And they always thought it was just a mask for naked personal power and thievery. So if that's a structural factor of Russian national character, maybe it is. I'm not sure. That made the Putin system, as I've described it, totally palatable and consistent in a way with Russian history.
Okay. Related to the annexation of Crimea, when Russia annexed Crimea, it was supported by some Crimean residents because they leaned more towards Russian roots. It was an international shock. How did that move fit with Putin's mafia kleptocracy, and how did that bolster his position as leader?
Well, it was wildly popular, what he did. It was consistent with Russian history and traditions, at least the way he presented it, because Crimea had always been a part of Russia ever since, the 18th century, except for a brief interlude when Khrushchev got drunk and gave it to the Ukrainians in the 1960s. So it was always considered by Russians to be a part of Russia. Putin also made a strategic argument that resonated with the Russian belief, the belief that I talked to you about we're surrounded, we're on the defensive, because what Putin said, and I think there was a lot to it, that once the Ukrainian regime fell, the Maidan demonstrations, and you had a new independent, theoretically democratic Ukraine, they started talking to NATO about bringing Ukraine into NATO. That is a Russian's worst nightmare, having a hostile military alliance right on their border. And it's particularly dangerous to geostrategic thinkers in Russia because the main Russian naval base is at Sevastopol in the Crimea. Crimea stays with Ukraine, Ukraine goes to NATO, Russia loses half of its naval bases and its entire access to the south. This too resonates with Russians. So, oddly enough, what we saw as a sinister, evil power grab, Russians saw as righting wrongs, protecting Russian speakers, and guaranteeing the security of the nation.
Okay, we still have quite a few questions to go. What are or should be the U.S. interests in Russia beyond our national security and beyond U.S. businesses eager to make money?
I was afraid somebody would ask me about American policy. I guess it comes with the territory. My opinion is that whether we like them or not, we have to deal with the Russians somehow. And I'm not talking here purely about missile treaties or security treaties. There are problems on the planet today that really require global solutions. And I'm thinking here of climate change. I'm thinking here of fundamentalism of all kinds, terrorism. I'm thinking here of supporting moves against hunger around the world. These are things that not one country can do. I mean, even the United States can't do all that, but it's obviously have to be done. Therefore, it seems to me that talking to Russians, even partnering with them on selected issues, is not only in our interest, it's in the interest of the entire planet. Now, that doesn't mean we give them the farm. That doesn't mean we cave into anything. But it means that we do isolate things that we can work on together to both of our benefits. We have in the United States in the past negotiated and made nice with people much worse than Putin. We snuggled up to Mao Zedong, other dictators around the world when it was in our interest to get something done. I don't think the fact that we don't like him, I don't think the fact that he is a ex-KGB thug and runs a thieving, corrupt economy, we don't have to like him to recognize the fact that on some things we need to cooperate with them.
Okay, how does the Putin you describe connect to the Putin who has inspired protests in the streets?
Many Russians, probably most Russians, are not used to protests. It's not something that was part of their, wheelhouse. It's not something that ever happened in the good old days, bad old days, depending on how you look at it. Therefore, there's not a huge amount of popular support for protests, and therefore there's not a lot of anger and wincing when the cops break them up. It's important to notice that who is protesting here. There are lots of protesters, especially around Navalny these days. There are lots of protesters, but if you look at them, they tend to be young, well-heeled members of, the thriving middle class. They're idealists. Many of them are intellectuals. You don't see poor people out there. You don't see workers out there. You don't see farmers out there. So it's easy, I think, to maximize or overemphasize the importance of protest against Putin. Aside from the fact that just mechanically, it's a piece of cake for him to break them up and put them down. They don't really pose a threat to him. I think in the American media, we would wish that they did. We see these protests, sometimes very big ones, as the beginning of the end for Putin, but Russians see it entirely differently. I know Russians, for example, friends of mine, when I ask them about the protests, they say they should go home, they should go to work, they should get a job. I'm too busy making a living to worry about stuff like that. The people who do worry about stuff like that, my friends tell me, they're people who have a cushy position in life. They can afford to take time and go out and hold signs. Most Russians believe that that's just a kind of a bizarre luxury. And if the cops want to beat them up, well, not so bad.
Okay. How do the youth of Russia tend to view Putin?
Well, it's hard to make generalizations about the youth of an entire country. I wouldn't do that about American youth, for example. But insofar as we can generalize, the young people are more skeptical of him than the older generation, because many young people have grown up or come of age, let's say, during the stability of Putin. Therefore, they don't have memories of the previous instability. The previous instability versus Putin really helps his support and popularity among the older middle-aged generation. But young people don't have a memory of what instability was like. They see Putinism, the stability of the economy, Putinism is kind of the baseline, the given. Isn't that the way it always was? Therefore, they are not so much Putin worshipers. Many young people there, according to polling data, many young people there just don't care about him one way or another. They're not into politics. They don't really worry too much about who's in charge or what it means. Like young people everywhere, like many of the students in my classes, for example, many young people in Russia are worried less about politics and more about their career. What are they going to be? How are they going to get a job? Day-to-day type stuff. So I wouldn't generalize altogether about young people in Putin. He does have his followers. There are Putin youth groups. He receives love letters from teenagers, volumes of them. There are Putin fans among the youth, but by and large, as a generalization, I would say they just don't think about him one way or the other much.
Andrea, I think you are, yeah, go ahead.
I am unmuted now. Do you think Putin will try to annex Ukraine, and will we be in a war?
No, I don't think he will do that. Because first of all, Ukraine right now is not part of NATO yet. So we have no obligation to defend Ukraine, no treaty obligation to defend Ukraine. I'm not sure such a war would be popular with Americans, particularly, since polls here show that a majority of Americans can't even find Ukraine on a map. Are we going to send our boys over there to die for Ukraine? I don't think he'll do it because it would make trouble for him. He would have, literally a big rebellious province to govern, and he doesn't want to do that. I think that the best proof of that, though, is that he hasn't done it yet. If that were important to him, annexing Ukraine, Russian tanks could do it in a weekend. Ukrainians are not geared up to resist. If he wanted Ukraine, he could have had it, very easily without a huge war at any time, up to now. He hasn't done it because I don't think he considers it in his best interest to do that. He does have troops, though, in eastern Ukraine, as we know, supporting the pro-Russian Ukrainian rebels. But that's not a prelude to annexing Ukraine. He has those there because it's still unclear where Ukraine's going to end up, what Ukraine is going to end up being. As long as Putin has boots on the ground, even in a small area of Ukraine, as long as he has boots on the ground, he's going to be a player at the table when Ukraine is decided. Ukraine can't go anywhere without Putin approving it because he's got boots on the ground, which is a clear message that I could have more boots on the ground if it goes south on me.
Okay. So a couple of questions that you knew probably were coming. Do you think Putin and his allies have leverage on Donald Trump? Do you think they cultivate him as an asset over decades, as recently suggested in American media by a former Russian intelligence officer who can't recall the name? And related to this, what is Putin's endgame in meddling in U.S. elections?
Yeah, I was expecting that. I was kind of hoping to get away without it. I think that, I wonder about this. Does Putin really have something on Trump? I'm inclined to doubt it. I think Trump was pro-Russian because he sees it as an area to do business in. I think that as far as Russian meddling in American elections goes, yes, absolutely, they are meddling. But we're the ones. The United States were the ones who invented meddling in Russian elections. You may remember how we funded Yeltsin's re-election with suitcases full of American $100 bills. A couple of them were intercepted and busted by Moscow street cops. These weird guys carrying around suitcases full of money and going into the Kremlin. The cops who did that were fired. So it's one of the Russian hypocrisy arguments. People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. You can't complain about us meddling in your elections when you meddle in everybody's elections all over the world. Secondly, I haven't seen any of the evidence that suggests that all of this meddling, which is mostly, propaganda meddling and fake news meddling, I haven't seen anybody who is prepared to document or support the fact that this changed any votes one way or another in the United States. I don't think this kind of meddling is particularly effective. I think it's kind of a stupid tactic for them to be pursuing. But again, it's part of life in the big city in the 21st century. It's part of the world system. Everybody has an interest in destabilizing opposing regimes any way they can. Everybody meddles in everybody else's elections. That's why, the original picture on the poster for this with Putin kind of, you see it up there. That's the expression he says when we say to him, stop meddling in elections. His reaction is, huh? Really? You stop first. All in all, I think it's a stupid strategy for them to pursue. Stupid because, it creates scandal. It creates animosity. And the return you get for that animosity just doesn't seem to be worth it to me.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we don't have any more time for any more questions. But I want to thank Professor Getty for a wonderful talk. It has stimulated a lot of interesting ideas for me, and I hope for all of you who attended. Thanks again, and good evening to everyone.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.